Ancient Egyptian has no verb that means to dream. The grammar allows exactly one construction: to see a dream. It happens to you. You do not do it. In the British Museum, 10 pages of papyrus lie mounted under glass across 4 frames, catalogued as EA 10683. Down the right edge of every page runs the same heading, repeated column after column, written large enough to catch the eye before a single other sign does. If a man sees himself in a dream, to its left, row after row, one image, one verdict, one sentence of consequence, good or bad. Nothing softer than that, and nothing gentler offered in between. Egyptologists call it the earliest and most complete dream interpretation manual to survive from pharaonic Egypt. It is not a couch, it is not a conversation, it is a table, no middle ground, no soft landing, a verdict, filed and closed before the reader has had time to feel anything about it. A man saw himself drinking warm beer. Bad. A man saw himself dead. Good. A man saw a snake. Good. A man saw his own penis. Erect. Bad. A pun decided it before the meaning did. 226 of these entries survive. Black ink for the good news, red ink for the bad, and every single one answered inside the same sentence that described it. Somebody, later, needed the back of the sheet for something else, and used it anyway. A roll that once told a man what his own sleep meant was not too sacred to become scrap paper for somebody else's letter, and nobody who touched it afterward left any sign of thinking that strange. If you want the fixed rule ancient Egypt used to close the book on its own dreams, hit subscribe now. This channel reads the documents the documentaries never touch, and it does it every day. The village this papyrus came out of has been on this channel before. Deir el-Medina, the walled settlement on the West Bank at Thebes that housed the crews who cut and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Its own people called it Set Mat, the place of truth. This time, the story is not the whole village. It is one household and one shelf inside it. In 1928, the excavator Bernard Bruyère opened the superstructure of a tomb chapel at Deir el-Medina and found a cache of papyri belonging to a single family of scribes. Not a temple storeroom, not the Per Ankh, the House of Life, the scriptorium where Egypt's priesthoods normally kept their technical and ritual writing under guard. A private house. Picture the moment loosely, because the papyrus itself will not describe it, and somebody has to. A sealed chamber above a burial, dust undisturbed for 3,000 years, and inside it a family's own papers, folded and stacked the way any household keeps what it does not want to lose. We do not know what Bruyère's workmen felt clearing that doorway. We know what came out from behind it. A private library that had never once left the family that wrote and reused it, sealed in with the dead the way the living had left it. It did not stay in Egypt. Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, a collector, acquired the family's papyri and gave them to the British Museum in 1930. In a single donation, the museum's own registers still record under its own name, the Chester Beatty gift. The gift changed what the museum's Egyptian department could offer scholars almost overnight, an entire family archive arriving as one lot, rather than the single loose sheets most museums were used to acquiring a piece at a time. 5 years later, the Egyptologist Alan Gardner published the full text of this one roll, transliteration, translation, plates. Volume 1 carries the reading, pages 9 to 27. Volume 2 carries the photographs, plates 5 to 12. Gardner called the papyrus, in his own words, the most imposing of the papyri in his series, imposing in its format and imposing in its calligraphy. Gardner did not stop at this one roll. The same family's cache produced a whole run of literary and religious papyri, and Gardner edited several of them for the same British Museum series, each keeping its place in his own numbering behind this one, Papyrus Chester Beatty I, carrying the old story of the contendings of Horus and Seth. Papyrus Chester Beatty IX, carrying a ritual for the deified Amenhotep I. A single sealed room, opened once in 1928, produced enough material to occupy one of the 20th century's most productive Egyptologists for years afterward. This account follows only the third roll in that sequence. 7 things about this scroll are worth taking slowly, and this is the order we will take them in. The house it came from, and why a family of tomb cutters owned a technical divination text at all. The 2 very different hands on the one roll, the scribe who actually wrote the dream book, and the far better documented scribe everyone now assumes did. A date that splits into two honest answers depending which half of the object you are dating. The machine the whole text runs on, column by column. A working sample of the ledger itself. Read the way its first owner read it. What kind of dream reading this manuscript was not, whatever a modern headline calls it, and what became of the idea more than 1,000 years after this particular copy was made. We start with the house. Deir el-Medina was, by the standards of the ancient world, a strange place to find private ownership of a technical divination text. Egypt kept its serious ritual and scientific writing inside temple walls, copied and guarded by priest scribes, attached to a specific house of life. This scroll sat instead on a shelf in a workman's village, in a family home, alongside a household's own private literature. The same cache that produced the Dream Book also produced a copy of the Contendings of Horus and Seth, and a ritual honoring the deified king Amenhotep I, whom the village worshipped as its own founding patron. A tomb cutter's settlement, an hour's walk over the ridge from the nearest temple archive, was keeping its own copy of exactly the kind of text that history books say belonged to priests. Nobody needed to petition a temple or wait for a priest's permission before this family could open the roll and use it. Deir el-Medina could do this because its own workforce read and wrote at a level almost nowhere else in Egypt matched. The village that maintained the crown's tombs also maintained, uniquely for a working settlement, rates of functional and administrative literacy that stood far above the ordinary agricultural town around it. The men who cut the royal tombs were also, in significant numbers, the men who kept the royal tombs owned paperwork. Most households in Egypt never owned a scroll of any kind, technical or otherwise. A tomb cutter's family at Deir el-Medina could own one outright, keep it on a shelf at home, and hand it down to whichever relative inheritance eventually favored. Exactly what happened to this one, 4 times over, across 3 generations. A family that could read a wage list could read a dream manual, with exactly the same trained eye, scanning down a column for the line that matched, the way it scanned a payroll for its own name. A fixed answer was not a strange thing to want from a dream, in a culture that already ran on filed paperwork for almost everything else a person needed: rations, disputes, absences. If a scribe could look up how much grain a man was owed, there was no obvious reason a dream should be any less fileable. Keeping a text like this outside temple control meant keeping it outside temple record-keeping too, which is very possibly the reason this particular copy survived at all. A version that stayed inside an institution's own archive was a version some later reorganization, fire, or simple loss of interest could just as easily have erased. This one survived because a family kept it, the way families keep things, imperfectly, but for a very long time. There is a small irony worth noticing before we move past it. The same cache that held a book sorting dreamers into followers of Horus and followers of Seth also held a copy of the Contendings of Horus and Seth itself, the old story of those same 2 gods locked in rivalry for the throne of Egypt. One scroll told the family a story about the 2 of them. Another told each reader which of the 2 he belonged to. Neither text explains the connection. The family that owned both did not need it explained. Almost everything this account can say with confidence about Papyrus Chester Beatty III. It can say because the roll survived as part of a group, rather than as a single scattered sheet, torn loose from its own context. A dream manual on its own, without the family's other papers, without the names a later owner scrawled across its own reverse, would be a text with no owner, no find spot beyond a general stretch of the Nile Valley, and no way to check one document's story against another's. Instead, it survived inside a paper trail that corroborates itself from several directions at once. A widow's will naming her own property in her own words, a scribe's letter to a vizier naming his own title, a literary poem copied for pleasure rather than profit, and, underneath all 3, a technical manual nobody in the family ever claimed credit for. Pull any one of those threads on its own, and the picture thins. Read them together, out of the same sealed doorway, and a household comes into focus that no single document could have supplied by itself. The house is documented, room by room, cache by cache. The Dream Book's own author is not documented at all. We begin the scroll itself at its own beginning as a piece of paper, before it was a museum object. 10 pages survive today, mounted as 4 separate framed fragments, numbered EA 10683, 1-4, and still carrying the single accession number across all 4. Gardner, measuring the sheet as he unrolled it in the 1930s, recorded it at 35 centimeters high and 172 centimeters long. The front, the recto, is laid out in 11 vertical columns of hieratic script, the cursive, everyday hand Egyptian scribes used for working documents, quicker to write than formal hieroglyphs and just as exact. The back, the verso, carries something else again, and it is not written by the same hand. The front is the dream book. The back is a different scribe's filing cabinet. His name was Quen-Herkep-Shef. Gardner transliterated it, Ken-He-Kop-Shef. And for a long time, the popular version of this object's story has made him its author. He was not. The recto is written in a careful, formal, literary hand, upright and disciplined, and nobody has ever managed to put a name to the scribe who used it. Quen-Herkep-Shef's own handwriting survives on the back of the same roll, and it looks nothing like the front. It is fast, it is bold, it is idiosyncratic, cursive, running ahead of itself in a way the front never does. He did not write the dream book, he owned it, kept it among his own papers, and when the front stopped being a text he needed to add to, he turned the roll over and used the blank side for whatever he needed to write next. The evidence for all of this sits in the colophon, the scribal note at the end of a text recording whose hands it is passed through, written directly onto the verso, in Quen-Herkep-Shef's own script, naming himself as keeper rather than author. We do not know who wrote the dream book. We know, from the handwriting alone, that it was not the man everyone names. Internal reckoning in his own documents puts Quen-Herkep's birth around year 16 of the reign of Ramesses II. Other records put him still active decades later in the reigns of Seti II and Siptah. A working scribal career spanning several kings, most of it on the evidence of this roll, spent owning a text he did not write. He served, by his own account, as scribe of the Great Tomb, the senior clerical post responsible for the crew that cut and decorated the royal burial itself. A man who spent his working life recording other people's absences, other people's wages, other people's disputes, kept a stranger's dream manual on the same shelf as his own working papers, and eventually put his own hand to use on the one side of it that still had room. What Quen-Herkep actually put on the back of somebody else's manuscript tells you what a senior scribe at Deir el-Medina spent his ink on when nobody was watching. An excerpt of the poem of the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II's own epic account of his fight against the Hittites in 1274 BC. A draft letter to the Vizier Panessi, written during the reign of Ramesses' successor, Meremta, dated by its own content to somewhere around 1224 to 1214 BC, in which Quen-Herkep-Shef names himself scribe of the great tomb of Ben-Re, beloved of Amun. A senior administrator did not need to copy his king's own war poem for any professional reason at all. He copied it anyway, on the evidence of his own hand, the way anyone copies out a favorite passage for no better reason than wanting to keep it close. Notes. Jottings. The ordinary residue of a working desk, filed on the back of a document about other people's sleep. Quen-Herkep-Shef died without children, and the roll did not pass to a son. It passed instead to his widow, Naunakde, a woman remembered today in her own right for a legal document of her own. The Will of Naunakde, a woman disposing of her own property under her own name, on the same family shelf that held a book built for a male reader and no other. Naunakde remarried a workman and scribe named Kamnun, and the roll passed into his household. From Kamnun it went to Amenakt, Quen-Herkep-Shef's son or stepson, who left his own notes on the papyrus near the 10th column, alongside everyone else's. Count them, and say it plainly, once, the way an inventory would. An unnamed scribe wrote it. Quen-Herkep-Shef owned it and used the back of it. Khomnun inherited it by marriage and kept it. Amenakt inherited it by blood and kept it too. 4 hands, 1 roll of papyrus across 3 generations of a single working family, and not one of the last 3 ever claimed to have written a line of what sits on the front. None of this made Quen-Herkep-Shef a priest, and nothing in his own surviving papers suggests he ever claimed to be one. He was an administrator, a man who spent his career filing letters, copying literature he admired, and keeping the tomb crew's own records straight. A dream manual fit on that shelf for the same reason the Battle of Kadesh did, because a literate household in this village collected the texts that interested it, without needing anyone's permission to own a copy. Visit the 4 frames today, and what stands between this text and total loss is a sheet of 1930s conservation glass, holding together a papyrus that had already survived 3,000 years without any glass at all. It was somebody's library book, long before it was anybody's exhibit. Ask when this papyrus was written, and there are 2 honest answers, and the honest thing to do is give both of them. The object itself, the ink, the papyrus, the hand that copied the dream text, is Ramesside 19th dynasty. Gardner, reading the handwriting directly, placed the copy in the period right after the reign of Seti I, early in the reign of Ramesses II, and he ruled out the alternative flatly. A 20th dynasty date, he wrote, is entirely impossible. Modern summaries round the manuscript to somewhere around 1279 to 1213 BC. That much is not seriously in dispute. The words on the page are a harder question. The dream text is written in Middle Egyptian, the classical grammar of a stage of the language that had, by Ramesses' own reign, already gone out of daily use. Gardner noticed this and drew what looked like the obvious conclusion. Gardner read the grammar. Gardner reached back for the oldest period it plausibly belonged to. Gardner published his conclusion in 1935, a genuine relic of the Middle Kingdom, copied out centuries later by a Ramesside hand. For decades, nobody seriously argued otherwise. It is a reasonable guess. On the current reading, it is also the wrong one. Gardner's reading went essentially unchallenged for the better part of 70 years. A whole generation of Egyptology cited the Middle Kingdom hypothesis as settled background, the way a textbook footnote gets copied forward without anyone checking the footnote underneath it. It took until 2003 and Cassius Spokowska's own full-length study of Egyptian dream literature for anyone to go back through the vocabulary and its everyday detail. The small, local, period-specific texture folded into individual entries and read New Kingdom life in it, not Middle Kingdom life. Her case is that Middle Egyptian, by the Ramesside period, functioned the way an older, formal register functions once nobody speaks it at home anymore. Not the language a scribe used because it was current, but the language he reached for because it sounded old, sounded weighty, sounded like a text that had already earned the right to be believed. It is the same trick a modern institution plays when it reaches for an old, formal language on a coat of arms. Not because anyone still speaks it day to day, but because the old form still carries an authority the new one has not yet earned. On this reading, the dream book was composed fresh in the Ramesside period, in a grammar its own author chose specifically because it did not sound Ramesside. So, a Ramesside object, plausibly written by a Ramesside author, dressed in a costume borrowed from an older Egypt. Gardner's Middle Kingdom original is the older theory, and it is the theory a later generation of Egyptology has largely set aside in favor of Spokowska's reading. Say the whole sentence. The manuscript is Ramesside, and its language is an archaizing Ramesside choice, and the claim holds up under its own sources. Say only Middle Kingdom and stop there, and it does not. The scroll itself is a study in two different kinds of age, sitting on top of each other, and by this point in the account that should not come as a surprise. It carries a Ramesside owner's rapid idiosyncratic hand on its back, and a Ramesside copyist's careful old-fashioned grammar on its front. Two different scribes, two different registers, on the same 11 columns of the same sheet, owned by a man who did not write it. Copied in a language 200 years out of daily speech by a man who chose that language on purpose. Layer sits on layer, and every layer examined so far has turned out to be exactly as old as the physical object underneath it, never older. Dating a text this old rarely comes down to a single test. It comes down to which kind of evidence a scholar trusts furthest, the shape of the letters or the shape of the sentences behind them. And on this object, for decades, those two kinds of evidence were assumed to agree. They do not. The papyrus is exactly as old as the dynasty that copied it. The grammar just dressed older than that. Open the papyrus and every page runs on the same mechanism, repeated with almost mechanical discipline down all 11 columns. First, the header. A single formula, written large down the right-hand edge of the page, governs every line to its left, if a man sees himself in a dream. It is not repeated line by line. It hangs over the whole column, the way a ledger's heading hangs over every row beneath it, silently doing the work so that no individual entry has to spell it out again. Second, the image. A short clause naming exactly one thing the dreamer saw or did. Drinking warm beer, looking out of a window, his own teeth falling out. Third, the verdict and its consequence. One word, good or bad, followed by a short sentence stating what the dream means. Not an open question, what it means. Picture, for a moment, the transaction this page was built for, because the papyrus itself never bothers to describe it and someone has to. A man wakes before dawn, the way the whole crew woke before dawn to walk up to the valley. He remembers what he saw in the night, and he goes to whoever in the household keeps this scroll. He does not get a conversation. No incense, no ritual, no waiting for a favorable hour. None of that is described anywhere in the surviving text. He gets a column read down to the matching line, a word spoken aloud, and an answer. Imagine one such exchange run all the way through, because the mechanism is easiest to see worked in full. A man says, "I saw myself killing an ox." The scribe does not ask what the ox looked like or how the man felt swinging the blade. He finds the line, "Killing an ox, good." The dream stands in for the man's own enemies, destroyed by his god the same way the ox was destroyed by him. Answer given. Run the exchange again, this time on a piece of bad news, because the method does not soften with the mood of the answer. A man says, "I saw myself looking at my own face in a mirror." The scribe finds the matching line without pausing to ask what the mirror was made of or how the man's own face looked back at him. Bad. It means a second wife is coming into the household, and the rivalry that arrives with her. No comfort is added. No exception is carved out for a man who does not want to hear it. The rule runs exactly as far as the entry lets it run, and stops exactly there, the same way it stopped for the ox and the crocodile and the warm beer. No record of an actual consultation quite like either of these survives to be checked against this account. The mechanism itself is exactly what the surviving page describes, whether or not this precise conversation ever happened. The ink is not decoration, it is part of the system. Good dreams are written in ordinary black ink, the same ink that carries the rest of the manuscript. Bad dreams are marked in red, the color Egyptian scribes conventionally reserved for the dangerous and the inauspicious, tied in Egyptian thought to Seth, to the red desert beyond the black farmland, to blood, and to Isfet, disorder itself. The same red ink was used elsewhere to write the name of the chaos serpent Apophis, and on one reading that is not a coincidence. Writing a thread in red was itself a kind of containment, a way of putting the danger in a cage made of ink before the reader had finished the sentence. Read down a column of this papyrus, and you already know whether the news is good before you reach the word that says so. The color told you first. The entries are not simply listed at random. They are sorted by the kind of person having them. Most of the surviving text, over 100 entries, sits under a heading for the follower of Horus, the default reader, the ordinary man the whole manual assumes it is talking to. The 11th and final column turns to something else entirely, a much shorter section for the follower of Seth, a different category of dreamer, followed by a protective spell. Egyptian religious thought held that different temperaments received, or deserved, different omens from an identical dream image. The book does not explain why a follower of Seth needs his own column. It does not need to. The household that owned this scroll already had on another shelf the whole story of why Horus and Seth never agreed on anything. Underneath the verdicts sit 3 interpretive habits, used again and again across the whole text, and Egyptologists studying the corpus have given each one a name of its own. Direct analogy is the plainest. The dream image stands for its outcome because the two genuinely resemble each other. The way bathing in the river means purification, because bathing in the river is what purification looks like. Symbolic inversion runs the opposite way. The dream reads backward against the waking world. The way seeing yourself dead is read as a long life ahead, on the same logic that a mirror reverses left and right. And Puranamasha, the pun mechanism, does not rely on resemblance at all. An erect penis, Nakt, becomes an omen of Naktu, victory, for the dreamer's enemies, not for him. The image and its meaning are connected by sound, not sight. None of it needed a therapist, it needed a scribe who had memorized the rules. Read a page of the dream book the way its first owner did, and the pattern turns almost hypnotic. A man sees himself eating crocodile meat. Good. He will hold an official's rank, and an official's goods will come to him. On one reading, eating the animal at the top of the river's own hierarchy means absorbing its authority, the same direct analogy that governs the river bathing entry. A man sees himself killing an ox. Good. His god will destroy his enemies for him, the same way. A man sees himself tending monkeys. Bad. Sudden, unpredictable reversal is coming. The animal's own restlessness read straight across into the man's fortune. A man sees small livestock wandering loose, unherded. Bad. His own property will scatter the same way, ownerless. Food carries its own logic, entry after entry. White bread, eaten in a dream, is good. Something pleasing is coming. Wine is good. An open heart. An evening of ease. Warm beer is bad. An Egyptian beer was drunk cool. A cup gone warm was a cup gone off, and the entry reads the dream almost as literally as it reads the drink itself. Suffering follows. The body supplies some of the harshest verdicts in the whole text. Teeth falling out is bad, and the stated reason is blunt. The people who depend on you will die at your side. Teeth and a jaw depend on each other to hold the bite, and the entry reads the loss the same way. Looking at your own reflection in a mirror is bad. As already read once, bearing your own backside is bad, and the entry follows the image all the way to its worst outcome. You end your life a beggar, with nothing. Sex and family produce some of the least intuitive verdicts in the whole manuscript, and the text does not soften any of them. Sleeping with your mother, in a dream, is good. Your own kin will stand firmly behind you. The dream reading a return to the mother as a return to the whole support of the family gathered around her. Sleeping with your sister is good. An inheritance, property passed down, is coming. Sleeping with a pig is bad. The pig was sacred to Seth, an animal of taboo and loss in Egyptian religious thought. And the entry predicts, you will be stripped of everything you own. Death reads backward from what you would expect. Entry after entry. Seeing yourself dead is good. A long life lies ahead. Seeing yourself in mourning, weeping, is also good. An increase in your possessions and your household's joy is coming. Being buried alive is the one death-adjacent image the book will not invert. It stays bad, and it is read as prison, not as the grave. Read enough of these side by side, and a rough shape appears. 226 entries survive by the modern count of what is left on the page, roughly 139 of them favorable, roughly 83 unfavorable, the two figures not dividing neatly because the papyrus itself is not perfectly whole. Favorable entries outnumber unfavorable ones by nearly 2 to 1 on the surviving pages. Whatever this book was for, it was not for keeping its reader in a state of dread every morning. More often than not, by its own arithmetic, the news was good. Looking out of a window is good. It means your prayer has been heard. Seeing a snake is good. It means food in abundance. And in one column, near the end of the surviving good news entries, sits the manuscript's own quiet joke on itself. A man sees himself writing on papyrus. Bad. It means his crimes will be reckoned by his God. Every single line, whichever column it falls in, runs through the identical 3-step machine described a chapter ago: image, verdict, consequence, without a single exception on any surviving page. What survives as 226 entries is what fits on the 10 pages that came through the ground intact. Whether the original roll ran longer before damage, carrying entries nobody alive has ever read, is its own small unknown, sitting quietly underneath every count this account has given so far. The true original tally, if it ever differed from what survives, went into the same silence that swallowed the compiler's own name. A scribe wrote a manual about what other men's dreams meant. Somewhere on his own page, writing itself was the bad sign. Call this the Egyptian Freud, and you have already gotten the one thing about it backward that matters most. There is no unconscious mind at work in this manuscript. There is no symbolic censor disguising a forbidden wish as a strange image, and there is no analyst's couch turning a private dream into 40 minutes of talk. The Freud Museum in London has run its own public program contrasting the two directly. Before Freud, it called The Event, a title that makes the point by admitting the two systems are not the same idea in different clothes. Chester Beatty III is not an ancestor of psychoanalysis. It is closer to its opposite: closed, deterministic, rule-bound. Image in, fixed verdict out. Set a page of it beside a page of Freud's own case notes, and the resemblance stops at the word dream. Nor is this folk psychology, in the modern sense of that phrase, some rough, pre-scientific first attempt to process a person's private anxieties. Egyptologists reading the text argue for something stranger and more literal than that. The sleeper was not generating the dream at all. It was a real encounter, arriving from the Duat, and the dream book's task was never to interpret a mind. It was to classify an event, the way a scribe on the same crew classified a delivery of grain, by kind, by quantity, by rule. There is no dividing line in this system between a dream about your own teeth and a dream about a stranger walking through your door. Both are treated as arrivals. Both get logged, sorted, and answered by the same fixed method, because to the compiler of this text, neither one came from inside the dreamer to begin with. This is also why the book never asks a single follow-up question. A modern reader half expects the text to pause somewhere and ask what the dreamer was worried about before he slept, the way a friend asks over breakfast. It never does. There is nothing to ask. The event already happened, on the far side of sleep, and the only job left is to look it up. The book does not leave its reader undefended against the bad news it hands out. On the papyrus's own back half, once the entries run out, the text preserves a spell invoking the protection of Isis and Horus, an awakening ritual, to be spoken by anyone who has woken from a dream in the red ink column. Gardner's translation of its opening survives whole. Hail, O good dream, which is seen by night or day. Driven out are all evil, impure things created by Seth, son of Nut. The instructions that follow are as concrete as the rest of the document. The herbs were fresh. The instructions are specific about that much. Mixed with bread, beer, and incense into something closer to a poultice than a prayer, and rubbed across the dreamer's own face to wipe the bad dream away the way you would wipe dust off a hand. How many men at Deir el-Medina actually performed this ritual on a bad morning, rather than simply owning the instructions the way a household owns a fire bucket it hopes never to use, is not something the text can settle. What survives is the instruction, not the practice. Read the whole surviving text front to back, and one bias is impossible to miss. Every entry opens the identical way if a man sees himself, not a woman. The dreamer this book was built for is a literate official worried about bureaucratic advancement, property litigation, and status. Exactly the terms Deir el-Medina's own workforce worried in on its own surviving paperwork, in document after document that has nothing to do with dreams at all. Status in this text is never a private matter settled between a man and his own conscience. It is public, transferable, and contestable. Rank that can be granted or stripped. Property that can be inherited or lost. A rival wife who can arrive overnight. Those are the anxieties the surviving entries keep circling back to, whichever category of dreamer happens to be reading them. The one document from this same family archive that survives in a woman's own name is not a dream text at all. It is now Nocte's will, a woman disposing of her own property, on her own authority, filed not far from a book that never once imagined she would open it. She did not need the dream book's permission to dispose of her own property, and the dream book, for its part, never once pictures a reader like her. This is a manual written by men like its readers, for men like its readers. It does not pretend otherwise. This is not the only Egyptian dream book to survive. It is the earlier of two, and getting this particular scroll into a museum case was its own separate labor, carried out by men whose names belong in the story too. Count how many manuals of this kind survive across the whole of Pharaonic and Greco-Roman Egypt combined, and the number is worth saying slowly. Not 200, not 20, 2, this one, and the later Demotic book. A third, smaller fragment, catalogued as Papyrus Berlin 15,683, preserves a few more lines of the same later tradition. But the two full manuals are the whole of the genre that survives in anything close to complete form. The roll that came out of the ground in 1928 was fragile enough that unrolling it was itself a specialist operation, not a formality. A British museum technician, C.T. Lamacraft, unrolled the sheet with the help of the conservator Hugo Ibscher, working the brittle papyrus open a fraction at a time rather than risk shattering 3,000 years of folds in an afternoon. The hieroglyphic transcriptions in Gardner's published edition were hand-drawn, column by column, sign by sign, by H.W. Fairman. None of these three men wrote a word of the dream text either. They are the reason anyone since 1935 has been able to read it at all. Most retellings of this object stop at Chester Beatty or at Gardner. Lamacraft, Ibscher, and Fairman rarely make it into the story at all, despite doing the physical work that made the rest of the story legible in the first place. More than 1,400 years after this copy was made, in the Roman period, a second Egyptian dream manual was written down, this time in Demotic script, on the papyri now catalogued as Carlsberg 13 and Carlsberg 14, excavated at Tebtunis and held today at the University of Copenhagen. Axel Volten published them in 1942, working from fragments dug up at a different site entirely, reading a text he had no particular reason to think of as a sequel to anything. Measure the distance between the two publications another way. Gardner had a named owner, a named find spot, and a colophon to work from. Volten had none of that. A later tradition, surviving only in pieces with no equivalent family archive to anchor it. The earlier book is the better documented one, not because it is older, but because it happened to survive with its whole household still attached to it. Gardner worked from a single physical roll in the 1930s. Volton worked from a different find, 7 years later, on a different script. Neither man was reading the other's discovery. Both of them ended up transcribing the same formula. If a man sees himself in a dream, the underlying idea had not moved in all that time. A dream is an omen, read by fixed rule, not a message to be freely interpreted. But the machine itself had been rebuilt, where Chester Beatty III sorts its 226 entries by moral outcome, the long run of good dreams, then the shorter run of bad. The Demotic book sorts by action instead, grouping every way of feeding an animal in one place regardless of whether the verdict lands good or bad. Where the earlier book speaks only to a man, the Demotic book carries dedicated entries for women. The punning wordplay that drives so many of the Ramesside verdicts, an erect penis read through the sound of its own name, not its shape, shows up less often in the later text, even as the broader habit of reading dreams through symbolic reversal and sound play persisted across the whole 1400-year span between the two books. Add a category of reader partway through a tradition's life, the way the Demotic book added women, and something in a text's texture always changes. This one lost some of its ancestors' love of a well-placed pun. It gained an audience its ancestor never once considered. The idea outlived the man who wrote it down. The specific trick of reading a dream by its echo did not travel with it undiminished. A genre that gets reinvented independently, 14 centuries apart, by scribes with no way of knowing about each other, is not a fad. It is closer to a solved problem, arrived at twice by scribes who never read each other's work. One idea. Two machines, 14 centuries apart. Step back from the columns and the verdicts, and what this scroll actually overturns is not a fact about ancient Egypt. It is a habit of talking about ancient Egypt. The habit is to reach for the nearest modern frame, a couch, a subconscious, a folk therapy session, and drape it over a document that was never built to carry it. Chester Beatty III survives specifically because it resists that frame at every level examined so far. An anonymous scribe's careful hand, reused by a named owner who never claimed to have written it. A grammar borrowed from an older century to sound authoritative in a newer one. A red ink warning system built for a reader who wanted the verdict before he finished the sentence describing his own dream. None of that is folk psychology. None of it is proto-Freud. It is bureaucracy applied to sleep, a fixed table of inputs and outputs run by scribes who treated a dream exactly the way they treated a missed workday or a lawsuit over an inheritance. Say plainly what is established, because most of it is. The fine spot is established. A domestic cache in a tomb superstructure at Deir el Medina, opened by Bruyere in 1928. The ownership chain after the roll left its first unnamed writer is established. Kenherkepshef, then Kamnun, then Amenacht, each leaving a trace on the same physical object. The manuscript's own date is established, Ramesside, 19th dynasty, the ink and the hand agreeing with each other. The mechanics of the format are established, column by column, down to which ink was used for which verdict, and so is the total, 226 entries on the pages that survive. The publication history is established too. Gardner's edition in 1935, made possible by the conservation work of Lamacraft and Ibscher, and the later comparison to the Demotic tradition through Volton's 1942 publication of the Carlsberg Fragments. Say plainly what is contested, because it is narrower than the popular version admits. What is contested is the age of the composition behind the copy, whether a genuinely Middle Kingdom text was carried forward by 13th century scribes, as Gardner believed, or whether a 13th century author wrote something new in an old-sounding grammar, as Szpakowska now argues, and argues with the better case on the vocabulary. Any retelling of this object that states Middle Kingdom as a flat, unqualified fact is repeating a 1935 hypothesis, as though 70 years of vocabulary work since had never happened. This is why the two-answer version matters more than a single tidy date would. Say only Middle Kingdom, and the scribes who actually held the pen, Ramesses' own contemporaries, choosing an old grammar on purpose, disappear from the story entirely. Say only Ramesside, and the deliberate archaism that made the text sound authoritative to its own first readers disappears just as completely. Both halves of the sentence are doing real work. The debate itself is real, and it is not a debate about whether the physical object is old. And say plainly what is not known at all. because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. The name of the man who actually composed the dream book is recorded nowhere on the object itself, and in no document that has surfaced since. Whether his original had earlier drafts that never survived to be copied by anyone is unrecoverable. Whether the other rolls from the same family cache, the contendings of Horus and Seth, the ritual for Amenhotep I, were read by the same people on the same evenings as this one, is not something a family's own reading habits leave behind for anyone to check. And how many households like Qin-Herqupshef's kept a scroll like this one is anyone's guess, because most of what Deir el-Medina wrote down did not make it into a museum case at all. It went, the way this text almost went, into somebody's fire, or somebody's rubbish, or the blank side of somebody else's letter. Put the 3 columns side by side, and the honest shape of this account becomes visible. What is established could fill a museum label: find spot, date, ownership chain, format, ink, total count. What is contested fits in a single sentence, and even that sentence agrees on the physical object underneath the disagreement. What is unknown is the largest column of the 3, and it will very likely stay the largest column of the 3. A compiler's name, a discarded draft, an ordinary household's private reading habits, none of which Papyrus was ever obligated to preserve just because a museum eventually wanted it to. A film that pretended otherwise would be doing exactly what it accuses a modern headline of doing: reaching for a tidier story than the evidence actually supports. Go back to the single grammatical fact everything else in this account sits on top of. Ancient Egyptian has no verb for dreaming as an action a person performs. It has only a verb for seeing something a person receives. Set that fact beside the scroll's own machine. A header that governs 11 columns without repeating itself. An ink system that tells a reader the verdict before he reaches the sentence explaining it. A pun that decides a man's fate by the sound of a word rather than its meaning. The grammar and the object turn out to describe the identical idea from 2 different directions: a language and a filing system arriving independently at the same conclusion. A dream, in this account, was never something a man made. It was something that arrived, uninvited, and got filed the same morning. We do not know his name. We know the rules he wrote down stayed in use for more than 1,000 years after he was gone. 226 verdicts. Not one of them asks how the dreamer felt. 4 owners, names attached to this roll across 3 generations of one family. And only one of the 4 ever gets called its author, in every popular retelling that skips the handwriting. None of the 4 wrote the text they were keeping. A scribe with no name wrote the rules. A scribe named Qin-Herqupshef kept them on a shelf, wrote a war poem and a letter to a vizier on the blank side, and never once claimed to have written a line of the text riding along on the front. A widow inherited it. A stepfather kept it. A son kept it after him. 91 years of publication, and the compiler still has no name. The book that a modern headline wants to call The Egyptian Freud was never asking what a dream meant to the man who had it. It was telling him, in red ink or in black, before he had finished describing it to himself. That is one document. There is one of these every day. Subscribe, and you will not miss the next one.